I have two very special guests with me here, and they're going to talk to us a little bit about something that we don't particularly love here in Grenada, but it's something that we need to speak about. I have with me psychotherapist Hazel Da Breo and Father Sean Doggett. Good morning, folks.
Good morning, good morning.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And how are you doing this morning?
We're doing well. It's a little early, but...
Yeah, I know. That's the usual comment. It's a little early, but we're okay. All right.
Pretty good so far.
Yeah, you usually get up this early?
Yes.
Oh, okay, so you're fine with this.
Sure.
All right, so we're here to talk about the crime rates in Grenada. I know it's 2012. We just started. It's a little bit early, but there have been, a couple of crimes happening, and what we've noted is that they're, let's say, somewhat unusual crimes. We've had like someone burning down a house not too long ago. We've had a death in prison and that type of thing. So tell us what's your take on the crimes that have happened thus far.
Would you like to begin?
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe if we look kind of deep at the kind of culture and the kind of ideology that we live in, and there's a kind of a culture of violence and a culture of crime that we sort of take for granted. So we look at entertainment and what a big part violence plays in entertainment,
right?
And the glorification of violence and the concept of revenge, and all of this, of course, is contrary to our Christian values as Christian people. But nevertheless, we put up with it, even feed our children on it in cartoons and amusement, and take it for a joke. So that's the first thing I'd like to say, that we need to work at changing the whole culture of violence that we live in, a culture of not only a culture of violence, but a culture of selfishness, of me first, and my needs must be satisfied, and what I feel must be right, and if I don't get my way, well, somebody will have to suffer.
Right.
That whole attitude, that we need to change that.
Ms. Da Breo?
Well, I'm happy to hear that once again Father Sean and I are speaking along the same theme, because I would also like to point to the culture, and for us taking responsibility for this aspect of our culture, which is the darker side, the ugly side. We don't want to have to discuss it, but as you've said, it's about time that we take a good look. So in my practice, we tend not to want to look at external influences for the things that we do ourselves. So while these are in fact quite important, what's happening in media, what's happening in entertainment, exactly as Father Sean said, if it comes to us taking responsibility of ourselves and blaming others, this is when I urge us and our culture to look in. I'm a child-centered practitioner, and I always bring everything back to the childhood experience. So we have adults in our culture who are acting violently. Where did it begin?
Right.
How do we discipline our children in Grenada and in the Caribbean? Elsewhere in the world, I'm sure, but here, do we not give them a slap? And what else? Many people who discipline their children with physical punishment don't just give a slap, they pull back and come from behind. And we have quite frightening incidents of brutality, physical brutality against Grenadian children. We don't like to believe that, but I unfortunately see it every day.
Right.
And when you get children who learn that you resolve dispute and you settle your conflict with not reason, not with logic, not with compassion, all the things that Christians are taught, we have the opposite part of the polarity, where children are just disciplined very quickly. Shut up. Slap them, end of story. How in the world are we going to take children who are raised like that and turn them into reasoning adults? Right. It's impossible. And I think that's one of the first places we need to look.
Okay. Now, that actually was going to be a a question I was going to ask you later, but related to what you were just saying, what is your take on corporal punishment? You know, and do you think that it creates violence or it helps? You know, what do you think? How is violence in society affected when something like corporal punishment is or is not in place?
Well, I mean, we seem to see the solution, as Dr. Da Breo said, to all problems of discipline in children as lashes and licks, and that's not the best way. It's not a good way at all.
Right.
So, as Dr. Da Breo said, we can't be surprised then when children use lashes and licks and blows, and later on chops and stabs as a solution to problems, because it's all they know. So we have to try to get away from that right from the earliest. Schools, I certainly don't think corporal punishment is appropriate in schools. I think there are other ways of dealing with indiscipline. But also there's a whole attitude, and Dr. Da Breo mentioned it or hinted at it there, putting people down, low self-esteem. You're wicked, you're stupid, you're bad, you're head hard. All this kind of belittling of people, especially of children and especially of boys. And I'm speaking particularly of Grenada now, where boys are expected to where they're put down. They're expected to misbehave, and then they're expected to take punishment, and that whole expectation has to change. Where boys, particularly, where they are raised with love, especially with a father figure who loves them and who spends time with them and who shows them how to resolve conflict. And I'm speaking here from experience of boys that I have known growing up and are now mature men. I'm speaking from experience, and I know that where they do get the attention and where they do get the love and the discipline, that proper discipline, that they do grow into mature thinking citizens.
So what do you say to the older person or the senior citizen that said, this is how I was raised, you know? When back in my days I did something wrong, my mother pulled out the belt and they sorted me out, and look at me now. I'm fine, I'm a well-adjusted person.
Well, that hasn't worked. I don't care how long it's been in the culture. We see now that it's not working. In the same way that people are speaking of climate change. We used to fish indiscriminately forever, and we may claim that is our tradition. We might be proud of the way we fished, but now we see that oceans are being depleted. Now we need to change. So the same argument to me, this is how I was raised. Well, okay, now we see that there are some parts of that that weren't so good and that do need to change. We must be able to do that. Regarding parents disciplining their children inappropriately with corporal punishment, I'm completely against it. I don't want us to sound as though we're blaming parents who are doing what they were taught. And especially when I look at single mothers who have 2, 3, 4, 5, 9 children. Now it's hard. It must be said that it's very difficult if everyone is crying for your attention at the same time. I had 2 children, and often it was too noisy for me. With 2, you have to struggle. But this is what you're supposed to do as a parent. Keep control of yourself. Despite all trying circumstances, right? Because this is what adulthood requires of you. We've seen where mothers, single mothers, in the absence of fathers of these children, the question here is, where are the fathers? But in the absence of these fathers, mothers take their children to the next available authority, which all too often is the police station down the road. My child is misbehaving, I don't know what to do, he's getting in fights, blah, blah, blah. Often they just take the boy down to the police station and say, deal with him for me. Why? Because they're looking for that masculine innocence, influence. And what do the police do? Put a flogging. Put a flogging. Not all the time by any means. But again, may I just look at the police force for a minute and mention that they are people too, and they were children too, and how were they raised? And is there any aptitude testing in place for hiring people to positions of authority who are given weapons? without understanding their personal background and how they are want to use this authority that you've invested in them. I mean, I mentioned aptitude testing. If you're about to hire someone who says, yes, I grew up violently. Yes, I was beaten as a child. Yes, I have consistently beaten down others and bullied throughout my adolescence. Are you going to say now, here's a gun?
Right.
I don't think so.
Well, of course, anytime we speak about crime, and then we bring the police into the case of Oscar Bartholomew, always comes up. So you would say that if these people were perhaps tested a little better, if they had an aptitude test or so, and if their backgrounds were checked, then maybe this sort of incident would not happen?
Well, I think so. I think it's one thing you can do. There's not, perhaps not a formula, but there are many checks and balances that we need to put in place, don't we?
Absolutely, yes.
Right.
Yes.
Not to mention the question of spirituality.
Yes, the question of spirituality, but also the whole question of the economic situation and poverty. Dr. Da Breo mentioned single parents struggling to bring up a number of children, and of course if that's aggravated by poverty and the struggle to put food on the table, that's going to aggravate the situation. I'm not saying poverty is the cause of all violence or unemployment, but they are factors that do influence the amount of violence that aggravate the situation. So certainly that must be looked at. But the whole question of spirituality too, and here we have to look closely at the role of the churches, because you know, you can read the Bible in a violent way, and you can look at all the violence in the Bible and you can use that to justify violence. But if we are Christians, we are followers of Jesus Christ, who certainly was not an advocate of violence, and in fact who said, blessed are the peacemakers, and who treated offenders in such a gentle and such a unique way, really, that went against the culture of the time. So if we are to be faithful to the teaching of Jesus Christ and really try to implement and to preach Christian values, we have to be very careful that it's Christian values we're preaching and not Old Testament eye for an eye mentality.
Right. Okay. Now, you mentioned something earlier, which is another question I had to ask, and it's tying entertainment to violence. Now, can you say that with the different trends in entertainment, particularly in music, you know, now back a few years, let's say for instance, gangster rap was the thing, and now these days it's more of a techno-ish dance vibe, and just the same with like dancehall music, you know, is badman music, and now they've all kind of switched over to the, you know, let's go peaceful. Now, do you think violence is directly related to this?
Well, I'm not by any means an expert on modern music, but I do think this would have an influence. I imagine it would. I believe it does have an influence on young people. What they're listening to, what they're absorbing, what's in their minds. I do believe that would have an influence on behavior. Dr. Da Breo might be better able to.
Oh, no, definitely, definitely. In the same way that if you send children to school and one child goes to school just getting over a cold, so immune system a little weak, not feeling so good anyway, but off you go to school. Other child comes in bouncing healthy, all systems blowing. Now, if there's a virus floating around the school, who's going to get it? The weak child. So if you bring your children up susceptible to violence and ready to take in all negative influences without guidance, without a strong spiritual foundation, they will fall susceptible, but not everybody does. So we can't just blame gangster rap. Back to parents and families.
But I take Aaron's point, though, that something we should be doing, and maybe the churches should be doing this, and maybe we should be using our church media, and maybe the programs like this can take a look at some of these songs and trends, as you mentioned there, and analyze them and see what really is being said. What are our children listening to on the buses as they go home from school or as they travel to school? What are they watching? And just face up to it and deal with it.
Yes.
Yeah, I just found it very interesting. She seems to have an analogy for everything. I thought that was a good one as well. But anyway, back to the question of influence. Do you think the societal awareness of violence? Like when people hear of violence, do you think it possibly influences or incites further violence? No.
Say that again.
The fact that when society is made aware of violent crime or actions that have taken place, like, can it influence another to get involved with crime as well?
Well, I have
How it's
another
presented.
story, if I
Yes.
may.
Great.
We heard, this is unfortunate, we heard of a stabbing, attempted homicide recently, I think on the weekend. And I don't know if it's true at all, but the rumor says that there was a man who stabbed his partner multiple times and left her for dead and burned her house. Again, I'm not sure how true it is. But what's going around in the community is that when neighbors found out what he had done, were horrified, as they ought to be, and what did they do? They held him and put a serious licking on him.
Right.
And people telling that story applauded the community action. But hold on a minute. Are we saying that beating is wrong? Well, you don't get to pick and choose. You have to get a principle,
exactly, yes,
get a
yes.
stand and hold on to it regardless of what's going on. So it can't be seen as terrible for a man to beat his wife and then okay for authority to beat the man.
Right.
Yes,
It's got to be wrong or right regardless.
Okay.
But to come back to your question, Aaron, it's how it's presented. It can be presented in a way that that makes entertainment of it, in a way that you know, in a way that sort of sensationalizes it and presents it in a morbid kind of way, in a wrong way, or it can be presented in a way that obviously shows disapproval and looks at the causes or whatever. But I can't say exactly. You know, technically, you people know much better. But I mean, the way it's presented is very, very important.
Right.
And of course, if there's a constant stream of violence, if this is something that's highlighted, then obviously that has an influence on people too.
And entertainment is seductive.
Yes.
It has to
Yes,
be.
yes, yes.
Movies,
Yes.
film, theater,
Yeah,
music,
yeah.
very seductive. That's how it functions. And if it's carrying a negative message, that message may well creep into your subconsciousness, and before you know what, you're singing a song with lyrics that when you stop yourself, my goodness, what am I singing this morning?
Right.
You know?
Okay. Back to your analogy again. You spoke about the man beating the wife and the authority beating the man. What is your stand on the death penalty?
Well, personally, I'm totally opposed to it. And the reason is that human life, every human being is created in the image and likeness of God. And human life is precious. And anything that diminishes human life, and that means drunkenness, drug abuse, violence, anything that belittles or diminishes a human being or devalues human life is contrary to the teaching of Jesus Christ, is wrong. And so taking a human life, killing somebody, is no way to show that killing is wrong.
There's a second part to the question, which is, does it, if with a death penalty in place and enforced,
Yes.
would it affect the amount of violence that
I
and
believe
crime
it
we see
does.
instead?
I believe it does.
In what
I
way?
believe it encourages violence. I believe it belittles life, and it encourages somebody, for example, who's engaged in a violent crime to actually kill the witness rather than let somebody survive and testify against them. And it just increases that whole cycle of violence, that whole level of violence by belittling human beings. And it does not decrease. I mean, if you take the case of Trinidad some years ago, where they executed 8 people in 1 week, and I don't think it had any effect on the level of violence whatsoever. And you look at places like Texas and other places where the death penalty is implemented, where people are put to death for crimes, the crime level has not gone down in any way. If you look at states in the United States or countries in the world where capital punishment is not practiced, the level of crime has not increased significantly. I think the figures would prove that.
Okay.
Exactly what he said.
Exactly what he said.
Yes.
All right. So back to here in Grenada and your roles here. What do you think is the church's role specifically in controlling violence in Grenada?
Well, not so much in controlling violence as in addressing the underlying causes, as Dr. Da Breo said, and as I said, like that mentality, that attitude, that culture of violence and death. The church's certainly role is changing that, addressing that, and that is what the churches, the mainstream churches, certainly are doing.
Right. Now, from a psychotherapist point of view, what can we do in the homes, you know, and parenting and so on? What can we do to curb this violence or increase, let's say, in Grenada? What can we do from our homes?
Well, frankly, that's long term, because we almost have to reverse the current of the tide that we're on now, and that's going to take some time. As they say, Queen Victoria doesn't turn on a dime. So we have to begin. We have to begin that work, and it'll take some time.
Yeah.
But I feel, conscious discipline. Maybe just beginning to teach conscious discipline in schools, which will translate back into homes, which gives me an opportunity to wonder about teachers. I'm hearing a lot of tales about teachers not helping children, but being exactly as aggressive and belittling and demeaning as anybody else out in the community. So maybe we could ask teachers to be more mindful of what their role is and the significance they have in helping upbring our children.
Yes. In fairness, though, a lot is being done. Conflict resolution classes and lessons, parenting programs, a lot is being done, and I have to say, while there may be teachers who are guilty of the kind of behavior you're talking about, many teachers that I know are doing an excellent job in trying to deal with this whole question of violence and lessen it.
That's wonderful there to keep reminding us back to the good that there is in people, because Grenada is just a splendid place.
Absolutely.
And most people are so good-hearted,
Absolutely.
so unusually kind. But there are these elements as well that need correction before it sort of takes us all down.
And Grenada is generally, I mean, although we've been highlighting the recent acts of violence, Grenada is not a violent. Yes, I've been speaking about the culture of death, but of all the countries in the world, Grenada is probably one of the most peaceful and one of the safest. And it's, I mean, if a tourist asks me, can I go here or can I go there, I tell them, yeah, there's nowhere you can't go.
Right,
really.
Of course. Sure. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Very welcome.
Ms. Da Breo. Father Dart. All right, thank you for coming on the show and enlightening us and giving us your views on violence and crime in Grenada. All right. Hopefully one day you can come back again and tell us about the good things.
I have a lot more stories to tell.
Great
trust
stuff.
me.